Right, what I'd like to do tonight is look, because we're approaching the season of Pentecost in the ecclesiastical calendar, so I'd like to look a little bit at a general heading, what really happened at Pentecost in the Bible. Not the Feast of Pentecost, not the Jewish feast, but on the day of Pentecost. What really happened? There's a lot of questions that you can ask, and I certainly won't be going into these all tonight, but there's questions all connected with that subject. Why did it happen on the day of Pentecost? Why were they baptized with the Holy Ghost? Why the word baptize? Why wind and why fire? Why did they speak with tongues? Why tongues? Why were they drunk as though with new wine? Why new wine? And why did they have to wait? Why could this day not happen until Christ was exalted? Why did it have to wait? A lot of questions, only one of them what I look at tonight. Let's look at the why fire. We know that on their heads there sat tongues of fire, and I'd like to look at some scriptures about fire in the Bible and see if we can build up a picture that will bring us to the reason why fire on the day of Pentecost. Genesis 15 verse 17. We have Abraham, and he was praying to the Lord. We'll look at various examples of fire being linked with the Lord. Verse 17, Genesis 15 verse 17. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp, or torch as your New King James will say, that passed between those pieces. The pieces, he'd had a sacrifice, he'd split the sacrifice in two parts, cut it into two parts, and the fire, it moved between the sacrifice. It's one of the ways of making a covenant. You'll read about this if you look in Jeremiah chapter 34 verses 18 and 19. You'll get the same concept. But I want to stay with Genesis 15 here, because we read of a smoking furnace. What do you think of when you think of a furnace? A furnace, well, it said in the Bible about a fiery furnace. You think of a fire. And I remember seeing the furnaces when I was a boy, when I was a young lad. I lived quite near to one of the biggest steel mills in the country. And I've forgotten the name. It might have been called a Bessemer steel mill. It was the old-fashioned way of making steel in those days. And every evening we would come out of the house and we would look at the skies, because they would open the ovens, the furnace. They would lift the ovens. I don't know why they did it, but when they opened the oven or the lid or whatever it was, all the sky was glowing with the fire that was from those ovens where they made so much steel. A smoking furnace and a burning lamp, a torch, a fire. There was something fiery, and it was moving between the sacrifice. We won't worry about the full significance of why this sacrifice was made and so on. That's a different subject. We'll just stay with the issue I want to look at, that fire represented the Lord come down to make a covenant with Abraham. It was his presence. But why was fire symbolizing his presence? You'll find this time and again that his presence is linked with fire. This smoking furnace, a furnace is no small fire. A furnace is a fiery thing. It really is hot and burning. And a torch, a burning torch moving down. Exodus 3 verse 2, very famous one. Another example, when we see the Lord who manifested himself in fire. It said the angel of the Lord appeared in a flame of fire. This is the burning bush. We all know this story. When Moses turned aside, he saw a bush that was burning, but it didn't go out, the bush wasn't consumed. And he went to see, what is this? And it said that the angel of the Lord appeared in a flame of fire. The angel appeared in a flame. And that angel is the Lord himself. If you look in verse 4, you'll see that it says that God was in that fire. And if you look at verse 8, it said God came down, the Lord came down. So the angel of the Lord was the theophany, an appearance of the Lord himself. Why did he appear in a fire? Why did he appear in that way? What's the significance? He came in a fire. In a flame of fire. God came down in that flame. Let's pick another one. We've already had the word furnace. Here's another verse with the word furnace. Exodus 19 and verse 18. It is when the Lord came down on Mount Sinai. What a blessed story it is. It was an awful story. Really, it was a frightening story. Even Moses said that he exceedingly quaked. And yet, it was God. And there's something about it. And even when you tremble and you quake at the presence of the Lord, yet a true man of God wants that presence. He wants that atmosphere. Moses saw this, the people of Israel saw it, and what do we read? Exodus 19:18, the Lord descended upon it, upon the mountain, in fire. Why did he come down in fire? Why did he come down in that way? What's the significance? He came down in fire. And the smoke ascended as the smoke of a furnace. We read in other places in the scripture of a fierce flame. This was a fiery furnace. This was raging. Remember the fiery furnace that burned the children, or was meant to burn up the 3 Hebrew children? Well, it didn't burn them up, but it slew the soldiers who simply opened the door to put people in. The flames of that furnace were consuming, a consuming fire. So the Lord descended upon this mountain in a fire like a furnace, a consuming fire. Why a fire? God had come down amongst them. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 4, it said, the Lord talked with you face to face in the mountain. How did he talk with you? When he spoke the 10 Commandments, he spoke out of the midst of the fire. God was in the fire. It didn't say God was the fire. The angel of the Lord in the burning bush appeared in the flame. Here it said God spoke out of the midst of the fire. The Lord descended upon the mountain in a fire. The Lord wasn't the fire, he descended in a fire. Let's move on. We've had the Lord now, he's represented by that burning torch, that flaming torch that went through the offering that Abraham saw. He appeared in the burning bush. He appeared on the mountain, on Mount Sinai. Now we have another verse, well known indeed, when he appears in the pillar of fire. Numbers 9, 15 and 16. At the evening, the Lord appeared, as it were, in the appearance of fire. In fact, it wasn't actually fire. It was appearance of fire. We'll come back to that sometime. He came in the appearance of fire. He was in the pillar of fire in the night. Exodus 14 verse 24, we know the Lord was in that pillar of fire. It says so. It said that the pillar of fire appeared in Numbers 9, 15, but in Exodus 14, 24 it says this, when the Egyptians were pursuing the children of Israel, it said this, that the Lord moved, the pillar of fire moved, the cloudy pillar moved and stood between Israel and the Egyptians, and the Egyptians could not do anything that night. And it said this in verse 24, the Lord looked through the pillar of fire at the Egyptians. He wasn't the pillar of fire. He was in the pillar of fire, and he looked through it at the Egyptians. He was in there watching. They could only see fire, but he was in that fire. Another verse. In Judges 13 verse 20, we read of the time when the angel of the Lord came and appeared to the parents of Samson to speak about the birth of Samson that was coming. And they didn't realise it was the angel of the Lord, because he wasn't in, all shining and so on that occasion. They thought he was maybe a traveller, but they began to realise that surely this is something special about this man. And when they realised a bit more of what was going on, they asked to make an offering, and the angel of the Lord said, go and make your offering. And when they put the offering out, the angel of the Lord touched the rock, and a fire came up from that offering and consumed the sacrifice. And then it said in verse 20, and the angel ascended in the flame, the supernatural flame. This wasn't a natural flame. He wasn't going up in a fire that they had lit by their own efforts. This was a supernatural fire. It was lit supernaturally, and the angel of the Lord ascended back to heaven in the flame. We read earlier in Exodus 19 to 18, the Lord descended in the fire. Now here we see the Lord ascended in the flame, in the fire. So we see from these number of verses how often the Lord is associated with fire. And it's the way he manifests his presence many times. But there's more. There's more. That alone is blessed. But everything, you will find fire associated with all the things connected with the heavenly court, God's court in heaven, his throne room, his attendants. You'll find fire is associated with them all. Let's have a look at some examples. Let's start with 2 Kings. Famous verse, 2 Kings 2 verse 11. Elijah had gone out. The Lord had told him he'd crossed the Jordan River, and now he was waiting for his home call. And what happened? We all know the story. There came a chariot and horses of fire. They came from heaven. A chariot of fire and horses of fire. You read the same thing a little bit later. If you read in 2 Kings 6 and verse 17, this is Elisha, and the time when the Syrians in their folly thought they could capture him. They wanted to capture him because the Lord was revealing to Elisha the secrets that they were talking in the most private places, and so they thought, we must catch this prophet and stop him. They must have been mad. For the same God who can reveal the secrets to Elisha that he was revealing to the king of Israel would tell them the plans that they were making as well if he wanted to. They must have been mad, but in their madness, the wisdom of man, they thought they would capture him. And so they sent their soldiers, and they surrounded the village where he lived, Dothan. And they came to get him, and his servant got up in the morning and he saw all the Syrian chariots, and he was really, really upset. And Elisha came out and said, basically, what are you worrying about? The Lord opened his eyes to see there's more of us than there are of them. And they saw the chariots of the Lord all around, the horses and chariots of the Lord surrounding his home, his village, and so on. Chariots of fire, horses of fire. Where did they come from? Fire, horses of fire. Chariots of fire. He saw what on earth did it look like when you looked out over the plain and saw this astonishing sight, horses and chariots of fire everywhere. Elijah saw it, and Elisha saw it as well at the first time when he saw the chariot coming down for Elijah. It must have been an astonishing scene, an astonishing scene. But we have another verse. These are chariots that are sent by the Lord. But the Lord has a chariot as well. I wonder what it is. Well, Psalm 68. Well, he has more than one chariot actually, but Psalm 68 and verse 17 says, the chariots of God are 20,000. Even, in other words, this is what the chariots are, even thousands of angels. His angels are his chariots. Now, what have angels got to do with fire? Why am I comparing, I've just said about chariots of fire. Now I've said the Lord has chariots, and I've said the chariots are his angels, but what's that got to do with fire? Well, it's quite simple. If you look in Psalm 104 verse 4, it said that God maketh his ministers flames of fire. And who are his ministers? Go and read the cross-reference. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 13, the latter part of verse 13 and verse 14, speaking of angels, it says he makes his ministers flames of fire. Speaking of the angels. So when it said the chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of angels, they're chariots of fire. Because his angels are flames of fire. So now we find that the Lord appears. He came down in fire, he was in the flame, he was in the pillar of fire, he was on the mountain in the fire, he came to Abraham in the fire and the flame, and he went through the sacrifice. And now we find that the Lord, he comes down among his people in chariots of fire. He doesn't only send chariots of fire, he has his own. But what about his ministers? Well, excuse me. We've already looked at the angels, but he has a number of ministers in heaven. We read about angels, archangels. We read about cherubim. And we read about the seraphim. So we know there are different types of ministers that he has in his court. We've already said that the angels, he maketh his ministers flames of fire. So let's read about the cherubim. We'll read from Ezekiel about the cherubim. Ezekiel chapter 1. I do remember in my earlier Christian years, I found this chapter so difficult, and I had to go through it very, very carefully and very, very slowly to gradually understand what it was saying, never mind what it meant. But I am so grateful for the time I have spent on this chapter over the years, because what I have learned from it has been very, very blessed. But let's look at verse 13. Chapter 1 and verse 13. Ezekiel has described how he was on the plain by the river of Kibar, and he described how he saw this great whirlwind coming and this great light and fire all approaching. And then he saw wheels and living creatures, as he calls them. They're the cherubim. Let me just get this straight from the very beginning. Chapter 1 speaks of the living creatures time and again. It's the same expression that's used in Revelation chapter 4. You'll find about the living creatures, or the beast, it says in the King James, 4 beasts. The New King James will say the 4 living creatures. And it says in Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 20, in plain English, this is the living creature that I saw, move on, and I knew they were the cherubims. The living creatures are the cherubim. So let's get that straight. So when we read about living creatures here, we're talking about the cherubim. And the cherubim The 4 cherubim are they who are around the throne of God. We read about that in Revelation 4, but we won't go into that now. Let's just stay with Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 13. It says this, "And as for the likeness of the living creatures," so I'm now going to describe when he saw these living creatures, he wants to describe what they were like. "Their appearance was like burning coals of fire, and like the appearance of lamps," that's an Old English torches, not lamps as we think of with a wick and a little bit of glass around them, torches, fiery. "And it went up," the fire in other words, "the fire went up and down among the living creatures, and the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning." So what were these cherubim like? It said, the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, and like the appearance of lamps or torches. They were glowing, they were fiery. The angels are flames of fire, the cherubim are like fire. The Lord comes in fire. He comes down and appears in fire. Let's look at the seraphim. Well, let's just take one more example about the cherubim. It's not speaking of the cherubim themselves, but nonetheless it's directly associated with the cherubim. We should know this verse well. Genesis 3 verse 24, at the Garden of Eden, after Adam and Eve had been driven out, it said this, that at the east of the Garden of Eden, cherubims, and the Lord placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword. The cherubims are fiery and the sword was fiery. We know the cherubims are fiery because we just read it. Now, from Genesis 3:24, there was a sword there as well, and that was fiery, associated with these cherubim, not held by them because there was one sword and the cherubims were plural. However many there were more than one, so they couldn't be all holding the sword. Right, let's look at the seraphim, the other type of minister in the heavenly realms. And these are referred to in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 2. And it tells us a little bit about them, about their wings and so on. Here we are, Isaiah 6 verse 2, and above it, that's above the Lord sitting on his throne, and the train filled the temple, and above it stood the seraphims. And it said each one had 6 wings and so on. We don't know anything else about the seraphim. So, are they fiery? Well, yes. How do we know? Well, it's as simple as pie. Because the very word seraphim itself means to be on fire or to be burning. So that's why they're called seraphim, because of what they are. The burning ones. Some people actually translate seraphim, the burning ones. So the angels are a flame of fire. The cherubim, their appearance was like a coal of fire. And the seraphim, they are the burning ones. So his ministers are flames of fire. And he himself, when he appears so often to man, he appears in fire. The pillar of fire, the burning bush, the way he came to Abraham, and so on. But it doesn't stop there. Let's carry on a little bit for a moment, looking around heaven. We can look around by reading Ezekiel 1 and a few other places in Ezekiel. You can have another idea. I know what happened in Ezekiel 1 happened on earth, but it was heaven come down to earth, and they saw what was in heaven on earth at that time. You could look at Revelation 4 and 5, and you find other verses in the book of Revelation. Let's pick a couple. What is before the throne? We know before the throne my surety stands. Well, all right, there's a few other things before the throne as well. It says this, Revelation 4 and verse 5, there are 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne. 7 torches, fiery torches burning before the throne. We won't go into what they are. Their full significance is a lovely meaning to them, but we'll leave that. Let's just get the basic principle. And then there's something else. What else is in front of the throne? You have the throne, and you have the rainbow around the throne, and he who sat on the throne. You have the 4 cherubim around the throne. You have the burning torches in front of the throne, before the throne. You have the, what do you call them now, the 24 elders, and so on. And you have something else. Before the throne, it says this in Revelation 15, well, it said in Revelation 4 and verse 6, before the throne is the sea of glass. Before the throne. But in Revelation 15:2, it says something else about this sea of glass. It said it's mingled with fire. Mingled with fire. Strange, isn't it? A sea mingled with fire. It's obviously, this is not natural fire. This is not fire as we know. Revelation 15:2, the sea of glass mingled with fire. And that sea of glass was before the throne, as it said in Revelation 4 and verse 6. So now we see, well, let's carry on. Let's carry on. Let's look at the throne itself. We'll look at Daniel for this one. In Daniel 7, it tells us something about the throne that you won't find from Revelation 4. So we'll look at the Daniel version, and here Daniel is given a vision of things to come affecting his people. Those things we won't concern ourselves with. We will stay purely with what it says about the throne. Chapter 7 verse 9. I beheld until the thrones were cast down, or put down if you like, put in their place. Thrones were set up, if you want to put it like that. And the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame. Not just a flame, but a fiery flame. You know, it's I don't know what word to use. It's flaming. It's really is burning high. And his wheels, whose wheels? The wheels of his throne. Because when Daniel saw the vision of the throne, he saw what Ezekiel saw when he saw the vision of the throne. They had wheels. The throne had wheels. Why? Because the Lord was still, shall we say, at war. He was still going forth to do various things. And the thrones of those days, the thrones of the Persians, those people, their thrones were mobile because they had to move about. The kings and the emperors, they went with their troops to various places to fight whoever, and their thrones were therefore, they had wheels. They were wheeled thrones. And the Lord is going about, the Lord of hosts, to fight his fights, and his throne is shown with wheels, and his wheels were like burning fire. The throne was like a fiery flame, and the wheels were like burning fire. So we really do see flames, fire. Remember those living creatures, those cherubim? Remember what they were like, burning coals? It says in Ezekiel 1:15, there was a living creature, a cherub, by each of the 4 wheels of the chariot of God's throne in Ezekiel 1. They were fiery, weren't they, those cherubim? And here it said the wheels were like burning fire. You find the same thing. Let's move on. It said in verse 10, it's Daniel 7 verse 10, and a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. So the throne was fiery, the wheels were fiery, and from the throne was fire streaming forth in every direction. That's what Daniel saw. What Ezekiel saw was the cherubim of fire. What Moses saw the fire, and so on and so forth. Let's move on. You've seen that the throne was fiery, You've seen the wheels were fiery. You've seen the ministers, his ministers were fiery. Angels, seraphim, cherubim, whatever, they were fiery. You've seen before the throne is the fiery sea of glass. You've seen the seven flames of fire, the torches of fire before the throne. All these different things, the seven lamps. And he who was on the throne, what was he like? The one that was on the throne. You've seen what the throne is like. You've seen what the wheels are like. You've seen what the ministers around the throne are like. You've seen what the things before the throne are like. What is he who was on the throne like? Remember, he appears in fire. Let's look a bit more closely and see what else we can find. We've seen how the fire is closely linked to his throne room, and we've seen how he appears in fire. Let's go further and see what else we can find. For there's more. Not only is everything around the throne fiery, but he himself is fiery. Not only does he appear in fire, which he did, he appeared in the flame, in the burning bush. He spoke to them in the pillar of fire, but he himself is like fire. Let's look at Ezekiel's vision again. And we'll have a look at chapter 1 and verse 4 and see what it says. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud and a fire, enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the colour of amber, out of the midst of the fire. Let's look at it again. What does he see? He saw a whirlwind, firstly. Then he saw a great cloud. We'll leave the whirlwind, we'll leave the cloud, let's stay with the fire. He saw a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it and out of the midst thereof. So it's not just that there was a brightness, how can I say, that the fire was bright. There was a brightness and a light from the midst of that fire that was shining out. Somewhere in that fire was a brightness inside the fire. And that brightness was as the colour of amber out of the midst of the fire. There was an amber-coloured something in the midst of that fire. So there had come a fire, but in the fire was something else. Let's move on and see if we can find out a bit more about it. What was that brightness like amber shining out of the fire and above the fire? The fire was bright, but this is above the fire. What was it? Let's have a look. There's something or someone inside that fire. Chapter 1 and verse 26. Go to the latter part of the verse. And upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as the appearance of a man above upon it. So he's seen a vision. We'll forget all the details. He's seen a throne and the likeness of a man on the throne. What does it say next? Verse 27. And I saw as the colour of amber, as the appearance of fire round about within it. So that's where that brightness was coming from. In that fire was the throne. And that is where the brightness is, and the colour of amber. It's in the fire was this throne. Carry on, verse 27. The appearance of fire round about within it, from the appearance of his loins even upwards, and from the appearance of his loins even downwards. I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire, and it had brightness round about. It's different from the light you get from a fire. There's a brightness because in the fire was the throne, and that throne was the colour of amber, which is what he saw when he first saw this fire approaching him. Right. If you want to read a bit more, I won't look at it now. Look at chapter 8 and verse 2 in Ezekiel. But let's move on to another passage now, which I hope will make it abundantly clear what I'm trying to get at. Revelation 4 and verse 6. I'm sorry, verse 3. Here is another vision, but this one isn't on earth. Ezekiel saw what he saw on earth. And he saw the throne with wheels, because the Lord had come down to earth. Here up in heaven, John saw the throne with no wheels, because this was a permanent abode. And he saw various things, and let's go to verse 3. He was in the Spirit. We need to be in the Spirit to see things like this. You really do. Educated academics can study it until they're blue in the face, but you need to be in the Spirit to see it. Verse 3, and he that sat on the throne was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone, and there was a rainbow round about the throne. Okay. What am I getting to? Well, what is jasper? And what is a sardine stone? Jasper, from what I understand, is a translucent yellow colour, especially a fiery colour. A sardine stone, or sardius, is similar. It's a yellowy brown or a translucent red. But both of them are similar and both of them are fiery. So, the one that John saw on the throne was fiery, and around him was a rainbow. And that's the thing I forgot to read in Ezekiel. We read Ezekiel 1:26, the latter part of the verse, and 27. I forgot to read the beginning of verse 28, and it says this, and as the appearance of the bow in the cloud in the time of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. There was the amber brightness, there was the there was a brightness inside the fire, and around that brightness was a rainbow. Exactly what John saw. He saw this fiery being with a rainbow around him. So what have we learned? Well, let's go on a bit more, a bit further. The one on the throne is fire. And it's true of all of him. Daniel 10 and verse 6. Daniel had a vision. He was in his 80s, so don't worry. You can have visions when you're young, and you can have them when you're old as well. Daniel 10 and verse 6, he was lying on his face in the presence of God. So when you're old, you can be lying on your face as well as when you're young, in the presence of the Lord. And it says this, chapter 10 and verse 6, his body, this being that Daniel saw, his body was like the beryl, and his face is the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire. His eyes were like burning torches of fire. The same thing is said of the vision of Jesus on the day of the Lord. Revelation 1 verse 15. He had eyes like a flame of fire. That was his eyes. What about his feet? Well, Revelation 10 and verse 1 will tell you what the feet of this one is. He's called an angel. Yes. But if you read it carefully, it's the angel of the Lord, the angel of the covenant, the angel that followed Israel and guided them through their earthly journey. And what does it say about him? Chapter 10 and verse 1, and at the very end, and his feet as pillars of fire. His feet as pillars of fire. So obviously that's his feet and some of his legs, isn't it? Because feet aren't pillars, you know, it's his feet and a bit more. Right, what else? Well, when he opens his mouth, what comes out? 2 Samuel 22 and verse 9. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth. And fire out of his mouth. His eyes were like fire, his feet were like fire. When he opened his mouth, it was fire that came out. He was fire. Well, what does it say? We read Hebrews 12:29, our God is a consuming fire. You get the same thing in Deuteronomy 4:24. The same words were spoken by Moses, that God is a consuming fire. It's not just that fire comes down from God. It's not even just that God comes down in fire, but the fire in God comes down. He may be in fire, but there's fire in him as well. It's not just God in the fire, but the fire in God. It's not just fire in him, he was the fire. So, what is the fire? Why is God so associated with the fire? Well, let's look at a verse. I think it's Acts chapter 7 and verse 3. I hope I'm right. No, it's verse 2. This is Stephen speaking to the Jewish leaders, the high priest and so on, and he says this: men and brethren, hearken, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared. Well, I'll cut in for a second. He's talking historically, the God of glory appeared. If you go to the end of this chapter 7, where has it gone?
56.
There we are, verse 55. Yeah. He's talking about the glory of God appearing historically to Abraham. Now it appears to him there and then. But he, being full of the Holy Ghost, looked up steadfastly into heaven and saw the glory of God. What he was preaching about, he saw. What a thing to see. Men and brethren, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia. Yeah. And the same God of glory appeared to Abraham not only in Mesopotamia, but he appeared to him in Genesis 15 that we've looked at a few minutes ago. And when he appeared, how did he appear? He appeared in fire, the God of glory. What does this fire mean? It is the glory of God. glory of God. The very presence, the essence of God. Let's have a look at a verse. Exodus 24 and verse 17. It said this, that the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire, or a consuming fire, as the New King James will say, on the top of the mountain. The sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire. The glory is the fire is the glory. What they saw, when they saw that fire, they saw the glory. Moses saw the glory in the burning bush. He saw the glory on the mountain. Abraham saw the glory going between the sacrifice to confirm the covenant. The glory of God was here. Ezekiel saw the glory of God. That's what it said. Ezekiel 1:28. He tells all these things about the fire. He saw this great fire coming towards him. He saw the cherubim and the fiery beings that they were. He saw the throne of fire. He saw he who was on the throne. And what does it say in Ezekiel 1:28? This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. The glory. What he saw was the glory. And he saw fire. Deuteronomy 5 verse 24. Behold, the Lord our God hath showed us his glory. And how did he show us his glory? And you have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. He hath showed us his glory, and you heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. So, what was the fire? The fire was the presence of God. The fire was the glory of God. What has this got to do with the day of Pentecost? Well, we'll have to leave it, because there isn't time to go into it. There's too many details, so we'll have to leave it to the next time. Amen.